Welcome. I am Tom Schuster, and this is Christianity Unearthed, the 4,000-year rise and fall of Christianity. Season 2 asks what the Bible tells us about Jesus and early Christianity. The earliest surviving gospel is not calm, it is raw. Mark is the first gospel in most reconstructions, and it is also the most unsettling. It does not begin with angels, genealogies, or reassurance. It begins with urgency, conflict, and a world in which catastrophe has not yet been turned into serenity. That is why Mark matters. Mark preserves a movement still close to disaster, still close to fear, and still trying to understand why God's agent suffers, why empire still stands, and why the end has not yet come. Later writers will use Mark. They will smooth it, expand it, and explain it. Later churches will prefer resolution. Mark still leaves the rough edges exposed. This episode, Mark, a gospel written under ruins, begins there. It asks what Christianity looked like before later memories softened the story, and why the earliest gospel still feels sharper, darker, and more unstable than the versions that came after it. The Gospel does not name its author. The title, according to Mark, is a later label from the late 2nd century, 100 years after it was written, invented when communities are copying, sorting, and trying to stabilize a library. A name is not a neutral label. A name is a strategy. An anonymous gospel travels more easily once it has an identity tag, tying it to a long-deceased apostle. This is the first blinker coming off. A modern Bible makes these texts look like a planned set, authored by known individuals, written in the places where the events happened. Mark is not that. Mark is anonymous, and Mark was not written in Jerusalem. Mark was written in Greek, and it occasionally pauses to explain Jewish customs. Quote, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands." Unquote. Mark 7:3. That aside functions like a small flag. It tells you that its audience needed explanations a Judean crowd would not have needed. Mark belongs to a diaspora world, communities living under empire, hearing news, translating memory, trying to survive. The story is written close enough to Catastrophe that Catastrophe still shapes its tone, shortly before or after 70 CE. This is not a gospel written from comfort. It is a gospel written to keep a community coherent when the center no longer holds. That pressure matters because Mark reads like a gospel written after something has shattered, not in the calm voice of a settled church. Mark is not called first because somebody voted on it. In fact, usually Matthew is given as the first gospel. But Mark is called first because the fingerprints of dependence are visible when you compare the Gospels side by side. As we established in the previous episode, the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke share large blocks of material. They have the same order of events. They sometimes share wording that is too close to be coincidence. Mark comes first, and Matthew and Luke use Mark as a baseline. The borrowing itself is evidence of a living process. Tradition is being handled, edited, and re-aimed. Mark often looks like raw material which later writers refine. Mark is shorter, Mark is rougher, Mark can be abrupt, Mark can preserve lines that are theologically or emotionally difficult. Later Gospels often keep Mark's basic structure and then adjust the rough edges. The later Gospels do not simply add information, they also change emphasis. They soften, sharpen, explain, and repair. A line that later Christians want to hear as smooth sometimes arrives in Mark as jagged. Mark can show Jesus refusing a flattering title. Quote, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." The line does not tell you exactly what Mark thinks about Jesus. It does tell you that Mark is willing to leave tension in the air. Mark can show Jesus in strong emotion. Quote, "He looked around at them with anger." Unquote. Mark 3:5. Mark can show Jesus in apparent limitation. Quote, "He could do no deed of power there." Unquote. Mark 6:5. These are examples of why later writers sometimes prefer to reframe Mark's version of the story. Mark's Jesus can be too raw for communities that want a more polished portrait. Mark is the seed because Mark forces you to confront the earliest narrative form which we possess, not the later harmonized shelf of books. Mark does not begin with a genealogy. Mark does not begin with angels or shepherds. Mark does not begin by explaining Jesus' childhood. Quote, "The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ." Unquote. Mark 1:1. Then Mark dives straight into John the Baptist, wilderness and crisis. Jesus appears as an adult, already moving towards confrontation. That choice tells you what Mark is doing. Mark is not trying to establish biological legitimacy. Mark is trying to establish meaning in a shaken world. Mark gives the program statement immediately. Quote, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news." Unquote. Mark 1:15. That line carries Mark's atmosphere. Time is short, decision is required, the world is about to end. This is not a memoir, it is a proclamation shaped into a narrative. Mark's prose often moves fast. Mark loves the feel of immediacy. Scenes rush, crowds surge, demons shout, the disciples stumble behind the pace of the story. The effect is not only stylistic, it is pastoral. A frightened community does not need a slow philosophy. It needs a story that can withstand real pressure. Mark's tone makes more sense when you hear the war behind it. With the temple fallen, the Jewish world is not simply sad. The Jewish world is reorganizing under trauma. The center has burned. Sacrifice has ended. Priestly authority has been shattered. Jewish identity has to relocate into portable practices, portable stories, and portable hope. Mark is part of that relocation. Mark does not give you a long discourse about the temple as an institution. Mark does something sharper. Mark turns Jesus' story into a pattern that can survive catastrophe. A community that has watched Rome crush Jerusalem must face a brutal question. If God's kingdom is near, why is empire still here? If Jesus is God's agent, why is God's agent executed? If the end was expected, why did the end not arrive? Mark does not erase these questions. Mark writes inside them. Mark does not need to prove Jesus existed. Mark's main problem is to explain why the Messiah suffers. A Messiah is supposed to restore and defeat enemies, not to die a criminal's death on a Roman cross. Mark writes for a community shaped by suffering, whether through persecution, war, or the delay of expected resolution. Mark's answer is not to treat suffering as a detour. It becomes the pattern. The suffering is not disproof. It is the path. This is why Mark trains the listener through misunderstanding. Confusion is the way the gospel prepares you to accept a Messiah who looks like a failure. If Mark's listeners feel ashamed of fear or disoriented, Mark shows that both belong to the origin story. One of Mark's strangest features is that Jesus repeatedly tells people to keep quiet. He heals someone and tells them not to speak. Unclean spirits know who he is and are silenced. He is confessed as Messiah and tells them not to broadcast it. This is called the messianic secret. Mark's answer is that recognition comes late, and recognition comes through the cross. Recognition before suffering would produce the wrong kind of Messiah, a victorious political hero. Mark's Messiah is a suffering figure. Hidden truth now, vindication later. If Mark's listeners are misunderstood, they are living inside the pattern. Mark is building a community that can survive by learning not to equate truth with triumph. Many readers find the disciples in Mark frustrating. They do not understand. They panic. They argue about status. They flee. Mark is not doing this by accident. Mark uses the disciples as mirrors. Quote, "They did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened." Unquote. Mark 6:52. The disciples are not consistently heroic. They are often dense. They miss the point. Jesus asks, quote, "Do you still not perceive or understand?" Unquote. Mark 8:17. They watch miracles and still do not see. They hear teaching and still do not understand. Jesus chides Peter, quote, "Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear?" Unquote. Mark 8:18. Mark is forming a community under pressure which needs a story that validates fear without blessing cowardice. It needs a story that says, you can tremble and still endure. Mark writes that kind of courage. Mark shows the disciples arguing about who is greatest, and then makes Jesus reverse the logic. Quote, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all, and servant of all." Unquote. Mark 9:35. Mark also uses the disciples' behavior to issue a warning about social climbing. Quote, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." Unquote. Mark 10:45. The listener is being warned against the same instinct. That line is not just moral instruction, it is Mark's spine. If Jesus' path is service and suffering, then discipleship cannot be domination. A community living under empire cannot survive by becoming what it opposes. Mark teaches that early. There is another layer under this mirror strategy. The author of Mark wrote over 40 years after Jesus' death. In his fractured and contested community, the apostles were honored. He knew that a gospel which presents Jesus' disciples as consistently clear and powerful would have handed too much authority to leaders in his community claiming to stand in their direct shadow. Mark does not erase the disciples, but refuses to let the authority become simple. Failure becomes part of the tradition. That is one reason why later writers sometimes feel pressure to adjust. A community trying to stabilize leadership does not benefit from a story that makes the founding leaders look confused and faithless. But Mark leaves it. Mark has a structural center. This short exchange turns the gospel from wandering conflict into a corridor towards Jerusalem. Peter says, quote, "You are the Messiah," unquote. Mark 8:29. Peter's realization is the turning point. From this moment on, the narrative tightens. Mark drives towards suffering. It immediately pairs Peter's statement with the shock that defines Mark's gospel. Peter protests. Jesus rebukes him, quote, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering, and be rejected, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again," unquote. Mark 8:31. Mark stages the clash between two Messiah concepts. Peter wants victorious deliverance. Mark's Jesus insists suffering is necessary. Then Mark turns that necessity into a demand placed on the listener. Quote, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me," unquote. Mark 8:34. That line only has force if the listener remembers what a cross is. A cross is not triumph. A cross is Roman public terror. Mark's phrase is a warning that discipleship is not safe. Mark is not romantic. Mark is blunt. This hinge also explains why it feels as though the text speeds up after chapter 8. Mark is shifting from identity puzzle to death corridor. Mark then repeats the same pattern 3 times. A passion prediction followed by misunderstanding, followed by teaching about true discipleship. It is Mark's way of drilling the lesson into the body of the listener. You can feel Mark insisting, do not build your faith on triumph. Build it on endurance. The first half of Mark often feels like movement through villages and crowds. The second half tightens towards Jerusalem, which is not a backdrop, it is the trap. Jesus goes toward the city knowing what it means. The disciples follow without understanding. Mark uses that movement to generate inevitability, a collision that you can see coming. The temple sits at the center. Mark constructs the temple sequence deliberately as brief and explosive. First, Jesus approaches the temple and performs a disruptive act that challenges its authority. Quote, "He entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple," unquote. Mark 11:15. This action stands on its own as confrontation. It creates enemies and places Jesus directly inside a political and religious center that cannot tolerate disruption. Mark then frames that action with a separate episode. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus had encountered a fig tree that bore no fruit and had cursed it. When the disciples returned, the tree had withered. Quote, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again," unquote. Mark 11:14. The sequence matters. The fig tree is not background detail. It is placed around the temple action so that one interprets the other. The temple is not being described as corrupt in a general sense. It is being presented as a failed center, like a tree that should bear fruit and does not. Mark's Gospel does not pause to explain this connection. It places the two events together and lets the structure carry the meaning. The result is clear. The temple action is not an isolated protest. This is not a small reform gesture. It is a prophetic sign act. It announces judgment. It challenges authority. Mark uses it to show that the conflict is baked into Jesus' mission. A Jewish prophet announcing God's kingdom and performing a disruptive act in the temple precincts during the volatile Passover season is a predictable target. Rome does not tolerate instability. Local elites, like the Sadducees, are allergic to disruption. Mark writes in a world that knows what happens when Rome decides to put an end to a movement. This is why Mark's Jerusalem scenes carry dread. The city is not merely holy. The city is a powder keg. The city is watched. The city is where messianic talk can become political death. Mark contains a long speech about disaster, persecution, and the end, often called the Little Apocalypse, Mark 13. It matters because it is one of the places where the time in which the author of Mark lived is most visible. Mark presents Jesus predicting the temple's fall. Quote, "Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." Unquote. Mark 13:2. It is unimportant whether Jesus spoke those exact words decades earlier. The function inside Mark is clear. The gospel wants the listener to believe that the catastrophe of the temple's destruction, which happened 40 years after Jesus' death, does not refute God's plan. Catastrophe is already inside the script. Mark then speaks into the current, for him, war atmosphere, unrest, fear, merchants of false certainty. Quote, "When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed." Unquote. Mark 13:7. That line is aimed at his community. It is Mark's author saying, "Do not collapse." Mark's speech also contains the kind of line that later becomes a pressure point because it is so blunt. Quote, "This generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place." Unquote. Mark 13:30. That line forces another blinker-off moment. Jesus and John the Baptist were apocalypticists. Early Christianity carries end-time urgency. Later, when time stretches beyond the predicted end, reinterpretation will become unavoidable. Mark does not yet solve that problem. Mark preserves the tension. The end still feels close. The wounds are still fresh. The horizon has not yet been pushed into calmer waters. Mark's miracle and exorcism stories are not random wonders. Mark uses them as conflict signals. They show that the world is not neutral. Mark's Jesus is an agent in a struggle. The crowd in the synagogue reacts to a miracle that he performs. Quote, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." Unquote. Mark 1:27. In Mark, authority is not primarily philosophical. It is power over what enslaves ordinary people. That fits a movement speaking to a frightened community. It also fits a world where impurity, illness, and unseen forces are the normal ways that people understood what is happening to them. Mark's miracles also generate conflict because conflict is part of Mark's engine. Leaders are provoked by healing on the Sabbath, forgiveness language, and eating with the wrong people. Mark's Jesus does not float above social conflict. Mark's Jesus triggers it. This is one reason why the miracles do not produce stable belief in Mark. Even wonders do not end misunderstanding. The miracles are not proof in a modern sense. They are narrative signals that the kingdom claim is colliding with the existing order. Mark also uses miracles to deepen the question of identity. The disciples watch storms obey Jesus. They watch food multiply. They watch demons recognize him. And still they ask, quote, "Who then is this?" Unquote. Mark 4:41. Mark keeps the question open because Mark is training the listener to keep moving toward the cross as the real disclosure point. Many modern listeners imagine Jesus' death as the result of a purely religious dispute. Mark frames it as politics. Rome crucifies. Rome has the power of execution. Rome does not crucify people because of fine points of synagogue debate. Mark's narrative includes Jewish leaders, yet the story culminates in Roman action. The charge is kingship, a category that the governor knows. Quote, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Unquote. Mark 15:2. The question is not a theological puzzle in Pilate's mouth. It is a category check. If the answer can be framed as yes, crucifixion will follow. Mark's trial scenes are not a courtroom transcript. They are a narrative designed to show how power behaves under crowd pressure. Leaders maneuver, crowds swing, Pilate calculates, fear spreads. Mark's community is learning how empire operates. This is also where later memory can become dangerous. As we saw in Season 1, the Gospels were written for worshippers within Jewish communities who, because they believed that the Messiah had already come, were increasingly in conflict with the synagogue authorities. As that conflict grew, the storytelling tended to shift blame away from Rome and onto the Jews as a generalized enemy. Two things are happening at once. Rome executes, local authorities collaborate in various ways. The story is not a clean moral courtroom drama. It is a collision between a disruptive religious political message and an imperial system designed to prevent instability. Mark writes so that the listener understands that crucifixion is not an accident, it is what empire does. Mark's crucifixion scene is not polished. It includes Jesus' cry that sounds like abandonment. Quote, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Unquote. Mark 15:34. Later Gospels handle this moment differently. Mark leaves it raw. Mark's Jesus is not a marble statue. Mark's Jesus suffers and trembles. Mark frames the cross as a public spectacle, mocking, stripping, shame, and the machinery of state terror. Mark is not trying to make the execution tasteful. Mark is letting the listener feel what crucifixion does to a body and to a movement. Then Mark stages recognition in an unexpected mouth. quote, "Truly, this man was God's son," unquote. Mark 15:39. A Roman soldier says it. A representative of empire speaks the recognition. Mark's irony is deliberate. The insiders misunderstand. The outsider sees. For a community living under empire and feeling misunderstood, this is not a random detail, it is reversal. Mark also includes a detail that reads like theology in narrative form. Quote, "And the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom." Unquote. Mark 15:38. Mark does not pause to explain, but the meaning is clear. The temple is not only a building in Mark's world, it is the center that is now collapsing or about to collapse. A torn curtain can be heard as judgment, as access, as rupture, as the sign that the old center is being split open. It is also the moment when the Holy of Holies, normally invisible to all but the highest priest on a single day of the year, is stripped of its protection. And it's torn from the top downwards, which could not have been achieved by a human hand. This is a glimpse of the apocalypse to come. The cross is not only the death of Jesus. The cross is the story through which catastrophe becomes interpretable. Mark turns the final meal into covenant interpretation. Passover is the Jewish festival of liberation from empire. Mark places Jesus' death in that frame so that the death belongs to liberation, not to Roman victory. Mark states it plainly, quote, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." Unquote. Mark 14:24. Covenant is not a church word first. It is Israel's word for a binding relationship with God. Mark is tying Jesus' death to the deepest available Jewish vocabulary of belonging. The line draws on the language of sacrifice, because in ancient Judaism, sacrifice is one of the ways in which people speak about repairing their relationship with God. Mark is using that language to say that the death is not meaningless. The meal turns catastrophe into something that can be understood as part of a covenant. This is one reason why later Christians will struggle over Mark. If meaning is built into the story, it can survive even when everything else collapses. The author of Mark is showing his community how to face shame without denying it, and how to speak about it as part of their covenant with God. An heroic story written later would have removed dread. Mark preserves it. Mark lets Jesus be overwhelmed, lonely, and afraid. The scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, a place outside Jerusalem where Jesus goes to pray before his arrest, validates terror and still models fidelity. Mark has him say it straight, quote, "My soul is deeply grieved, even to death," unquote. Mark 14:34. Then he prays, quote, "Abba, Father, remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want," unquote. Mark 14:36. Mark's Jesus does not glide into death untouched. His Jesus asks for escape and then submits anyway. That is not weakness in Mark. It is the pattern which Mark's community needs. If they are afraid, fear does not disqualify them. If they are exhausted, exhaustion is part of the original story. What matters is the direction of loyalty. The disciples fall asleep. They fail. Mark again uses them as mirrors. Failure was present at the beginning too. Then Mark drives the humiliation deeper. Jesus is arrested. The disciples scatter. The movement collapses in the moment it should have stood firm. Mark's author is not hiding the mess. He is telling the truth as his community needs it. Collapse can happen, and still the story does not end. Many readers assume that all the Gospels end with the resurrection story, and with appearances, and with the apostles going out to foreign countries. Mark's earliest ending does not. Mark ends at 16:8 in the earliest strong manuscript tradition. The women go to the tomb. They find it empty. A young man tells them, quote, "He has been raised. He is not here." Unquote. Mark 16:6. Then Mark's Gospel ends with fear. Quote, "They went out and fled from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Unquote. Mark 16:8. This ending is psychologically hard. It is unfinished. It offers no appearances, no reassurance, no closure. That abruptness is not a bug in Mark's world, it is a feature. Mark has been training the listener to accept fear as part of faithful life. Mark ends by leaving fear on the table. The resurrection claim is announced, but the human response is still trembling. Mark's ending also functions like a question thrown at the listener. If the women say nothing, who will speak? If the story stops, who will continue it? Mark's Gospel ends with the community's responsibility still alive. This is one reason why later hands could not tolerate that ending. Mark leaves fear on the table. The resurrection is announced, but the human response remains unresolved. That is not an accident. It is Mark's theology. Faith begins where the certainty ends. A crucified Messiah is not validated by spectacle, but by trust under pressure. The story stops. The question is handed to the listener. Will you speak, or will you remain silent? You have been listening to Episode 5 of Season 2 of The Winner's Tale. Mark is the earliest surviving narrative of Jesus. It is urgent, apocalyptic, written close to Catastrophe. It preserves a suffering Messiah, confused disciples, a torn temple curtain, and an empty tomb ending in fear. It is raw. It is unresolved. It refuses comfort. Mark does not give you the finished system. Mark gives you the origin point. The next episode stays with the Gospel of Mark and asks what happened to that seed once it entered the hands of scribes, communities, and competing theologies.